no, not at all. Not at
So,
all.
that is how we'll all be enlightened by what he says, illustrations, etc.
Thank you, sir. I would like to request Mr. Parth Contractor to say a few words about this excellent web series is organized by the Chamber of the Parth Contractor and eminent faculty of the state of Gujarat practicing before the Honorable Gujarat High Court, all across on the webinar series. The efforts, definitely, I need not to say anything about that. It has already been proven by way of the excellency, by way of the attendees, by way of the response from the faculties and everything. In totality, absolutely a grand success, historical and very eventful. Now over to Parth Contractor to say a few about the how your thought process come about this organizing such a web series during this such a lockdown or pandemic situation.
We still have another 3-4 minutes to start. So before we begin, to answer what Dhruven Bhai has said, in fact, this whole thing began with a thought clicking onto my mind to say that घरे बैठा बैठा कहीं ना करिए ना करता थोड़ा थोड़ा लोगों भेगा थे यानी कहीं let us start learning something. I bounced off that idea with Shalin Bhai, Anshin Bhai, and they in fact suggested that it would have been a wonderful idea if we could do something like that. It started with a seed where about we had not anticipated. We were looking at about 30, 40, 50 people coming together and learning something from the speakers that we were planning to line up. But with the support of the AGFTC ITBA, once they joined in, it grew much bigger. The response we started receiving from attendees, litigants, clients, lawyers, unexpected that we would, I had never intended to cross 60, 70, but day in, day out, we have been crossing about 450, 500 people every single day across platforms like Zoom, YouTube, as well as live that we've been doing. So unexpected completely, but very happy that people have been joining us every day. Dhruven Bhai, I in fact was happening to see the Zoom list of attendees, and about 50% of the attendees generally are repeats through the 9-day series. So I'm really happy, and thank you to the speakers. Thank you to AGFTC, ITBA for giving us access to this platform. I'm really happy that this has turned out the way it has.
Thank you, Parth sir. Now we have with us the eminent advocate Dheeraj Tisa, is the president of the Notary Association Gujarat and All India Notary Association, serving and president emeritus of the Income Tax Bar Association. I would like to request to say a few words about the webinar. Over to eminent advocate Dheeraj Tisa sir.
First of all, I am thankful to both the association, Federation and Income Tax Bar Association, as well as Parth Contractor, joining us in this series. I have to say one word: it is excellent. All the lawyers and other people will be benefited a lot by this seminar. We cannot have this much knowledge after reading hundreds of books, which will be acquired within these 9 days, lifelong. So I must say one word again. Thanks from my heart. All notary from across the India have joined yesterday and today. They are very happy, have got good feedback. Learned speaker, Justice Devani, they have done remarkable work, homework, and lot of knowledge they have given to us. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Dhruven Bhai, before we begin the seminar, the webinar today, may I request Anshin Bhai also to say a few words, please?
Yes. Very early good evening to everybody. Before we start with today's session, let me first thank today's. Let me just first thank Mr. Parth Contractor, my friend, who has done a marvelous job, and as this was his idea, with the help of the associations, he brought up this idea and has successfully done the work and has really last 10-12 days we could all pass good time constructively because of Parth. He's done an excellent job. So first and foremost, congratulations to Chambers of Mr. Parth Contractor. Secondly, to Mr. Dhruven Shah, President AGFTC, Mr. Vishwesh Shah, President ITBA, Mr. Dhiresh T. Shah, President All India Notary Association, and all the speakers for having keeping us all occupied in these turbulent and disturbing times by arranging for these webinars and sharing their knowledge. All the sessions were attended on Zoom to their full capacity of around 500 all throughout. I think all the attendees, students, lawyers, friends from High Court and all other courts all around the state and others have sincerely attended and even asked good questions. We also made all sincere attempts to answer to the best of our knowledge and capacity. We may be wrong sometimes, but the effort was certainly there. The views expressed in these sessions were all according to the speakers, including this session. Knowledge and experience may be not to the point at times, but we all gained out of these sessions. And despite there being other webinars being conducted at parallel time and otherwise, there was full audience, participants were enthusiastic, and so were the speakers. And therefore, thanks once again. And I may ask my dear friend Shalin to start the session with the permission of all of you.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. May I?
Yes, Shalini, please go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, thanks, Parth. Bar Association, the All India Notaries Association, and all other local associations for inviting me. Thank you for the kind words. Anshin, you're right. All my oratory skills are going to be tested out. You're always guilty of exaggerations, but that's fine. And my message to the tax associations is that as soon as COVID gets over, I'm coming to you to learn income tax law because I'm a zero. I'm zilch in that. So, but thank you so much.
Welcome.
Okay. Parth, may I? Before I start, I'd like to tell you how I propose to approach this topic. There are 5 parts to this topic. Part number 1 is race between 2 fundamental rights as I see it. Part 2 is which one is better, because is it that one fundamental right trumps the other? Part 3, thanks Parth. Part 3 is how does the Supreme Court of India deal with situations when both these rights appear before it, in cases that come before it. And in this case, today we'll discuss 3 past cases and 1 pending case. Part 4 is the burning issue, freedom of speech in today's times. Everyone is aware that this is the age of information technology, and with so many social networking sites, which are essentially very, very powerful platforms for voicing our opinions. So what does freedom of speech, what is the value of freedom of speech in today's times? That's going to be part 4. Part 5, we'll talk a bit about US, a comparative perspective of the doctrine of free speech in the US, how different it is from India. And then part 6, obviously, I will summarize what do we take away from this webinar. So that will be the conclusion. Okay. So let me start with part 1. Now, it's interesting. If you see the title of the topic, it's defamation versus freedom of speech in today's times. Clearly, all of you are seeing only one fundamental right there, isn't it? Because it's freedom of speech. So obviously, that's the first one in this case. Freedom of speech, it is in 19(1)(a), 19(1)(a) of the Constitution, the lucid words are that every citizen has the right to free speech and expression. Okay, and obviously, mind you, this 19(1)(a), the freedom of speech is not an absolute right under our Constitution, because immediately after 19.1, you have 19.2, which talks about reasonable restrictions. And 19.2 says that nothing shall prevent the state from making a law to impose reasonable restrictions on the exercise of free speech on so and so, so and so, and all those restrictions are listed. There's a laundry list actually of 7, 8 restrictions, and obviously one of them is defamation. And defamation is way down the order, but obviously it falls in 19.2, which means that freedom of speech is obviously subject to defamation. So the state can make a law, and here, in fact, we have that law, because if you see section 499, apart from defamation being a tort, if you see section 499 of the IPC, it defines defamation, and section 500 of the IPC makes defamation a crime. So here, I mean, you'll have people say that, look, how is this possible? Because the Constitution is of 1950 and IPC is 1897. But then the clear answer is that Article 13.3 of the Constitution protects all these pre-existing laws. And therefore, defamation, which is in 499 of the IPC, though it's a law predating the Constitution, it is a law under 19.2, and therefore your freedom of speech, our freedom of speech, is obviously subject to 19.2. So that you have here that's the first fundamental right. Which is the other fundamental right in issue? That's interesting. Obviously, defamation can't be a fundamental right, but the interesting part is that this, as I told you, is a story between two fundamental rights engaging, competing for attention, for enforcement. And the other one is, interestingly, the right not to be defamed. Okay, in popular terminology, you will say that it's the right to reputation. And if you locate right to reputation, you'll find that in the genesis of that right in Article 21 of the Constitution. Well, I mean, the plain language of Article 21. Article 21 says that no person shall be deprived of his life and personal liberty except in accordance with law. So naturally, again, the question will be that, hey, where is reputation in all this? But interestingly, what the Supreme Court has done is that the Supreme Court has held and argued that life, these words, life and liberty, they are not empty terms. Okay, and so essentially these words, life and liberty, have several derivative rights to make life meaningful. It's not mere animal existence, and to make liberty worth cherishing. And this actually, as these derivative rights are often called penumbras, emanations or nuances of life and liberty. So that's how we got our right to reputation under Article 21, because this is, I would say, it's a wholesale creation, and rightly so. It's a wholesale creation of the Supreme Court of India, and just for case law buffers, there are several judgments on this, but 4 of them clearly, just one by one, I'll run them quickly. Kishore, the first one is Kishore Samrite versus State of UP 2013, 2 SCC page 398, where the Supreme Court said that the right to enjoyment of a good reputation is valuable privilege of ancient origin and necessary to human society. These are, so the Supreme Court said, it talked about reputation, good reputation, and that too a privilege of ancient origin. Okay, as if it's something like a natural law which existed even before the Constitution came into force. The second one is Sukhwant Singh versus State of Punjab, 2009, 7 SCC page 559, and the Supreme Court here said that the right to one's reputation is a facet of right under Article 21. So this is exactly where the Supreme Court located the right, Article 21. Again, Article 21 only says life and liberty, but obviously it is to be, reputation is to be ready. The third one is State of Maharashtra versus Public Concern for Governance Trust, 2007, 3 SCC page 587, where the Supreme Court said reputation of an individual is an important part of one's life. And then the fourth one, the last one, is State of Bihar versus Lal Krishna Advani, 2003, 8 SCC page 361, where again the Supreme Court said that the right to reputation is a facet of the right to life of a citizen under Article 21. So clearly you can see that reputation is a mere penumbra, it's a nuance, it's an emanation coming out from the words life and personal liberty, and we have firmly located that in Article 21. So that's how now we have two fundamental rights, 19(1)(a), freedom of speech, and then on the other side you have right to reputation, Article 21. So that's part one for you. Now we come to part two, and obviously the question will be that in most of the cases that come before the courts, when you have these two rights and these two rights appear to be on collision course, then what do you do? I mean, obviously the question that will have to be answered is whether one is better than the other or not. Does one trump the other? And I mean, just to give an example how these rights collide, one example would be that if I mean, today my host, Parth, contractor, is very kind to me, but suppose Parth, tomorrow he suddenly gets up and says that, look, Shalin Mehta is a potted plant, he's a dud, and who the hell gave him a license to practice law? And he would just say that, look, this is Article 20, this is Article 19(1)(a), it's free speech and it's protected. On the other hand, Shalin Mehta, he would get up and tell Parth that, Parth, you know what, you may be right, I am a potted plant, but then I also have a reputation to protect, and that's under Article 21, and therefore you can't trample on my right, which is an Article 21 right. So obviously, when these two rights collide with each other, and this happened before the Supreme Court, and what did the Supreme Court do? So this happened in the case versus Union of India, 2016, 7 SEC page 221. So who doesn't know Mr. Swamy, right? Mr. Swamy is supposed to be the Ralph Nader of India. He's a crusader. He's filed several petitions, and so this time he came up with a brilliant idea of challenging the constitutional validity of sections 499 and 500 of the IPC on the ground that this is an archaic law and it is an unreasonable restriction on the freedom of speech under Article 19(1)(a), and therefore it should be struck down. And in fact, one of his main arguments before the court was that, look, that guy's right to reputation must yield to freedom of speech, which is my right to say something on political issues. What did the Supreme Court say? The Supreme Court declined. The Supreme Court said that, sorry, Mr. Swamy, we can't do that. And this is what the Supreme Court said. Let me quote the exact words, that reputation being an inherent component of Article 21, it should not be allowed to be sullied solely because another individual can have his freedom. Reputation of one cannot be allowed to be crucified at the altar of the other's right of free speech. And the Supreme Court, most importantly, also said that it is the duty of the court to strike a balance so that the values are sustained. So clearly, the teachings of the Supreme Court in Subramanian Swamy are that when courts are confronted with these two rights, which appear to be on collision course, the court just can't say that, look, I favor this one or I favor that one, and I'm going to give up the other one. No, the Supreme Court says that the courts will have to balance it out, strike a balance as far as possible. So clearly, so as far as part two is concerned, the answer is that if you ask me that whether one right trumps the other, the Supreme Court has said that doesn't happen. Okay. Now, coming to part three, so all this is easy, isn't it? Because we've just answered. We have said that, okay, we know that both rights are important and one doesn't trump the other. But the most difficult part is, what do you do when you deal with actual cases, real life cases, and how do you decide them? And this is exactly what the Supreme Court does. What the Supreme Court essentially does, and what all courts do, is called line drawing. Okay, and I mean, people in the past have said that, look, line drawing, it is what usually you do in art, but obviously even when judges decide cases, they do that. People often say that line drawing is so difficult, and here the Supreme Court has said that, well, the difficulty of drawing lines has never really deterred the court from drawing lines. And therefore, in this context, let us talk about 4 cases, 3 past and 1 present case, that how does the Supreme Court strive to draw a line? Okay, the first one on your screen is R. Rajagopal versus State of Tamil Nadu, 1994, 6 SEC, page 632. This was the Justice B.P. Jeevan Reddy writing for the court. So here, the facts were really interesting. There was a really bad guy. Remember Gulshan Grover's bad guy? Okay, there was a really bad guy called Otto Shankar, and this guy he had committed 6 murders and he was sentenced to death. And when he was in prison, he wrote about himself. He wrote his autobiography and gave a copy of it to his wife because he wanted it to be published. And this autobiography ultimately landed in the lap of a Tamil weekly magazine from Madras. And obviously, this book had a Bollywood angle to it because this guy, Otto Shankar, had mentioned about his nexus with several IPS, IAS, and other officers who were partners in crime. So when the Inspector General of Prisons actually got wind of this, all hell broke loose because obviously he had to find a way to restrain the publication of this. So what he did is he wrote to the Tamil Weekly and said that, look, you can't publish this book because this book is not written by Otto Shankar. Okay. The publisher petitioned the Supreme Court of India, and what did the Supreme Court say? Well, this is, so let me quote, this is, as I said, Justice B.P. Jeevan Reddy speaking for the court. He said that the publisher has a right to publish what he alleges to be the life of Otto Shankar, insofar as it appears from the public records, even without his consent or authorization. Look at the words, because the Supreme Court says that even for publishing, you don't even need the consent of Otto Shankar if he has given the book to the publisher. Neither government nor the officials who apprehend that they may be defamed have the right to impose a prior restraint upon the publication of autobiography of Otto Shankar. There is simply no law which can prevent the publication of a material on the ground that such material is likely to be defamatory of them. So clearly, if you see the line drawing by the Supreme Court is that this is a prior restraint on publication. We won't permit that. The Supreme Court, in this case, if you read the entire case, the Supreme Court was asked to go into the question whether 19(1)(a) is subject to 19(2), obviously defamation. And the Supreme Court said that, look, we won't go into this aspect because this is a prior restraint. And the Supreme Court said that 19(2) reasonable restrictions, they kick in only after publication. It's not a case, it doesn't kick in before publication. So this is how the Supreme Court drew the line in the first one. But again, having said that, I'm not really sure whether this is an absolute test, because I don't think the Supreme Court needs to say that every single publication, every single piece is protected unless it is published. So there can't be a prior restraint, because in fact you'll see that in the next one, which is a publication case. And I'm sure that if you tweak the facts of the second case, suppose, because the second case deals with a poem on Mahatma Gandhi, and I'm sure that if that were the case here, I don't think the Supreme Court would have allowed even prior publication of that. Okay, I mean, the Supreme Court would have said that this test will not apply in this case. That's my hunch. So let's come to the second one. The second one is Devidas Ramchandra Tuljapurkar versus State of Maharashtra, 2015, 6 SCC, page 1. Now this is a publication case. So what happened here is that a salacious and obscene poem titled Gandhi Mala Vithala, I Met Gandhi, was published. And it was published in a magazine meant for private circulation. Just to tell you, because I mean, what was objectionable, because the thing about Gandhi that was mentioned in this book was, I'll just quote exactly what was said. that when I met Gandhi on earth, which is the property of the common man, playing husband and wife games with orphan children, he said, Nidharmi Bharat ka kya pachan. So, so this was the objectionable, this was the obscene, this was the defamatory part. And what happened is that a complaint was filed with the police alleging commission of offences under section 153A, 153B, and 292 of the IPC. The magistrate eliminated sections 153A and 153B, but he retained section 292, which is selling obscene material. The Sessions Court and the High Court affirmed. The matter went to the Supreme Court, and in the Supreme Court there was an interesting twist of facts, because the publisher he came up with folded hands, and he sought a discharge. He said he gave an unconditional apology, and the Supreme Court just let him off. But the poor poet was stuck, and the Supreme Court actually in this case declined to quash the charges against the poet under section 292. And Justice Deepak Mishra, as he then was speaking for the court, he said, and these are his words, that the way to determine these cases is to apply the judicially evolved contemporary community standards test. So he's saying that the question to be asked of the court is that was the poem on the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, obscene given the contemporary community standards test of India. And in fact, I can just let me just exactly quote what he said. He said that when the name of a historically respected person is alluded to or used as a symbol, speaking or using obscene words, the concept of degree comes in. To elaborate, the contemporary community standards test becomes applicable with more vigor, in a greater degree, and in an accentuated manner. What can otherwise pass the contemporary community standards test for use of the same language as not being obscene can be considered obscene if the name or persona of a historically respected person is used as a symbol or allusion or surrealistic voice to put words or to show him doing such acts which are obscene. So clearly, Justice Mishra was of the view that, okay, to test the test of obscenity is that you apply the contemporary community standards test. But he was clear in one thing, that this concerns the father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, and therefore, when you apply that test, you have to apply it with full vigor, which means more rigorously. And therefore, if we were to tweak the facts of the case a bit, this case actually, and I'm just thinking that suppose the poem was not about Mahatma Gandhi at all. Suppose the poem was about, let's say, a fictional character or a deadbeat dad. I don't think the Supreme Court, applying the contemporary community standards test, the Supreme Court would have found this to be obscene. But here, especially since the poem named Mahatma Gandhi, and Mahatma Gandhi, obviously father of the nation, who can say he's not a historically revered and respected personality? The Supreme Court found that this was actually crossing the line. Yes, before I leave this, I must say that quintessentially, this was not a defamation case. If you see, this was section 292. But if you read the whole case, it is clear that obviously the aura of defamation was definitely lurking in the Supreme Court's mind, because if you read the definition of defamation under section 499, defamation can be of a dead person as well. Okay, so yeah, probably the Supreme Court didn't expressly say so, but I'm sure that this was definitely in their minds when they refused to quash the charge against the poet under section 292 of the IPC. Okay. So we come to the third one. The third one is N. Radhakrishnan versus Union of India, 2018, 9 SCC 725. Okay. So this also is a publication case. Interesting. The facts are interesting. What happened here is that a petition was filed in the Supreme Court seeking a mandamus to restrain the publication of a novel called Nisha, on the ground that this novel was defamatory of temple-going women, and it hurt the sentiments of a particular faith and community. And why was this defamatory? Because the Supreme Court actually mentions the exchange. There is an exchange in this novel between two friends. And so one friend is asking the other that, do you know why women dress up and they take a bath in the morning before going to the temple? And so the other friend says that, well, it's to pray. And so the first one says that, no, it's not that. It's actually their way of unconsciously proclaiming to the Brahmin priests that they are ready for sex. So this exchange came up before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had to decide whether this falls on the right side of the line or the wrong side of the line. And very, very interesting. This again, it was Justice Mishra doing the work for us. Only this time he had become the Chief Justice. An interesting twist, because Chief Justice Mishra came to the author's rescue, and in para 39 he said that the court is not to be swayed by any kind of perception. One may have a grave dislike towards a particular manner of expression, but that would not warrant a ban on the book. Again in para 41 he said, if books, note this, if books are banned on such allegations, there can be no creativity, and it will spell the death of art. So very strong words, but so here you'll see that Chief Justice Mishra coming to the author's rescue. He was the one who authored the earlier opinion of which had the poem of Mahatma Gandhi, where he refused to save the author. But this time he said that, well, if you're going to ban books on such allegations, then this will spell the death of art. Clearly, to me, it is not really a change of heart by Chief Justice Mishra. If you tweak the facts of this case, suppose this case did not mention about temple going women in general, but suppose this case named a persona, okay, named a personality, named an actress, named a real life person, I'm sure the court would have said that, no, this is defamatory, this is crossing the line, and we are not going to protect this. Okay. So again, this is how in these three cases, the Supreme Court has drawn the line. As I said, the first one, prior restraint, Supreme Court says that we are not going to allow prior restraints. And the other two publications, well, one was found to be objectionable, the other was not found to be objectionable. The last one is obviously the much talked about case of recent origin, very recent origin, Arnab Goswami versus State of Maharashtra et al., which is now pending in the SC Supreme Court. So facts. So what did Arnab Goswami do to make these Congress workers go to the court and file multiple FIRs? FIRs filed in several states, actually, Maharashtra, Punjab, and some other states. So what happened is that in one of his shows broadcast on Republic Bharat, Arnab said during a discussion on the Palghar lynching incident, and let me quote his exact words because this is what was reported. He said this, that will Sonia Gandhi remain quiet? She is quiet today and she is happy that the saints have been killed where her government is ruling. She will send a report to Italy that she is getting saints killed in a place where her government is ruling, and she will get praises for that. Close quotes. So this is exactly what has come up before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will have to decide that whether this merits a charge or the charge is to be quashed. I would only say this, that so again there are two views. Arnab Goswami's camp would obviously argue that, look, who can deny that Palghar lynching incident is obviously a hotly contested political issue of today's times. And if we are to survive and if we have to evolve as a nation, then all such political issues need an uninhibited, robust, and an open-ended debate. And he would also, I mean, they would also argue that in journalism, a certain amount of exaggerations and hyperboles is allowed because that is what free speech jurisprudence is all about. So that's what they would say. The other side, the opposite party can well argue that I mean, this should not be protected by the Supreme Court, because there is little value in this sort of speech, because simply if you just examine his all the 3 or 4 statements, actually, that the first one is that Sonia Gandhi is quiet today, but I mean, the other side, the opposite party will say that, well, Sonia Gandhi has no right to. I mean, there is no affirmative duty on her to speak, isn't it? That she has a right to remain silent. Then the second one, she is happy that saints are killed. The opposite party would say that, how do you know that? Because what is in the mind, even the devil doesn't know. The third statement, that she has sent a report to Italy. Oh, sure. How do you know this? Unless you are Sonia Gandhi's circumstantial courier, you will know this. And the fourth one, that she is getting saints killed and she's getting praises for that. Again, I mean, the question is that how do you know all this? And so, I mean, the other side would probably argue that this actually is a case of inciting people and stoking hatred in them, and therefore this speech should not be protected. Well, we can only guess at this juncture, because in the coming days, Supreme Court will obviously take a call on this, whether Arnab Goswami miscalculated this time or he was right. So that's that. So this, we've seen how the Supreme Court draws the line. Now we come to the most part 4, which is one of the most important parts of today's topic, because this really is inextricably linked with our lives, isn't it? Free speech in today's times. Mind you, today's modern times, this is not Charlie Chaplin's modern times, okay? These are today's times, and today's times, this is the age of information technology, the World Wide Web, and obviously cell phones. And clearly, I don't think anyone can deny that the World Wide Web, information technology, and cell phones have brought about a sort of mini revolution in our lives. I can live without my spouse, but I can't live without my cell phone, is how some people would define themselves. Yeah, I mean, seriously, on a serious note. And because, I mean, we all see that it's impossible. One day you can't have, one day you can't afford that you don't have your cell phone. Also, I've done a bit of research on this, and I've seen that I just found out that as on June 2019, there are 65 plus social networking sites lurking around us. Obviously, I can't name, but I mean, you're all aware actually that there is Facebook, WhatsApp, QQ, WeChat, Qzone, Tumblr, Instagram, Twitter. Okay, let me show off now. Baidu Tiba, Skype, Viber, Line, Snapchat, YY, Pinterest, LinkedIn, Telegram, Reddit, Foursquare, MySpace, Flixster, YouTube, and of course TikTok, which is insanely popular with the kids these days. But the thing to remember is that these understand this, that these are extremely powerful platforms today to voice your opinions, to criticize, to discuss, to meme, to parody, and to do all kinds of things, isn't it? And also the speed. The important thing is that the speed at which all this can happen is just mind-boggling. A press of a button, a mere press of a button on your cell phone or whatever, your iPad or whatever it is. Okay, and I mean, if you ask me what borders, there are no borders in this case, right? Isn't it? Because I mean, my text, I can send my text message to Burkina Faso, Varkoyans in Siberia, Santiago in Chile, Galapagos Islands, anywhere, just anywhere in this world actually, because those borders are eliminated. And therefore, since we have become beneficiaries of such a powerful technology, I feel that there is a greater need for responsibility and caution as well. Interestingly, the Supreme Court has made a passing reference to these platforms, and let me just talk about those two cases. Actually, nothing. I mean, the facts of the case are quite different. But the first one is Manik Taneja versus State of Karnataka, 2015, 7 SEC page 423. And here, I mean, this was, I believe, a quashing case, but I mean, nothing really related to the facts of this this topic. But the interesting observation that the Supreme Court made in this case was about Facebook. That the Supreme Court said that Facebook is a public forum meant for helping the public. That's important. The second one is Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan versus Union of India, 2018, 17 SEC page 324. And this is, if you recall, this is that famous Jantar Mantar case where the protesters, they argued that we have a fundamental right to be at Jantar Mantar and protest and say things that we advocate and that we would like the public to know. And the Delhi High Court didn't allow that. The Delhi High Court passed a restraining order. Delhi High Court said that, look, this you guys are causing a hindrance to the public, to the traffic, and therefore we won't allow this at Jantar Mantar. And the case went to the Supreme Court. And interestingly, one of the arguments made by these protesters before the Supreme Court was that they should be allowed to protest at Jantar Mantar because Jantar Mantar is actually the place where they can have the people actually hear them. Because any other place like Ramila Maidan and all those places, they are not places where it was accessible to the people. And well, the Supreme Court said that no, we won't allow that argument. Interesting, the Supreme Court said that these are the words actually, that we are living in an era of technology where a concerned voice by a group of persons can reach the right quarters by numerous means, and note this, and social media and applications like WhatsApp, all these were named, WhatsApp, Twitter, Instagram, etc., take no time in spreading such events. So this is exactly what the Supreme Court. So Supreme Court referred to these powerful platforms and told the protesters that, look, we refuse to believe you when you say that no, Jantar Mantar is the place that we need. What you want to convey can be done through these other platforms, obviously these social networking sites. So if we are to compare the two ages, I would only say this, that in the newspaper age, in the earlier age, all of us, in a sense, were not drivers of our own vehicles, because if I had to say something, I still had to have a publisher. And if I wanted to reach out to the public, I still needed a publisher. In today's age of social networking and information technology, I think that we all, to an extent, have become drivers of our own vehicles. And if that is so, then I would say that the old adage, the old maxim that drive as if you own someone else's car should apply. So I'll just say this. I'll sum up and say that if all of us, and it's a fact, if all of us have acquired so much power over our lives, and we are in a position to voice our opinions so easily and so speedily and anywhere, and our opinions reaching anywhere in the world, I think this also calls for additional responsibility and caution on our parts. If the other right, remember, the other right, the right not to be defamed, the right to reputation, is to have any meaning at all in today's world. So that's about part 4. We come to part 5. Parth, do we have time? Should we? Okay. If we have time, we can do this US perspective, because it's not really help.
Shalit bhai, you can go ahead. We have sufficient time. We will also have time to take question and answers.
Okay, that's what I'm interested in. Okay, fine. Yes. So then let me finish this. Okay. So US, just a comparative perspective, free speech. We all know that several cases, US is one of the leading countries. And as far as the structure is concerned, interestingly, the free speech doctrine in the US is located in the First Amendment. So for those of you who don't really have an idea of the US Constitution, interesting. So the framers made a tiny constitution of 7 articles, and then what they did is that all these political and civil rights, they started adding them to the articles by way of amendments. Actually, the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third Amendment, Fourth, and so on and so forth. And I believe the last amendment they added was in 1992, I believe the 27th Amendment, if I'm not wrong. I don't think they've added anything after that. But okay, so as far as the First Amendment is concerned, the interesting thing is that the language. And so the language is that Congress, this is what it says, the Congress, because in the US, we call it the state, but it's the Congress there. The Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech and of the press. So this, if you just compare, if you compare the language of Article 19(1)(a) with the First Amendment, clearly our 19(1)(a) is couched in positive terms. Every citizen has the right to free speech and expression, but then obviously subject to reasonable restrictions. The marked distinction, the First Amendment, interestingly, is couched in absolute terms, because it says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech and press. Now, this obviously, given its absolute language, a very interesting thing happened. So there was this language generated a bit of a debate in the US between the absolutists and the non-absolutists. The absolutists, they were of the view, it's a group of justices. So they were of the view that, look, the language, the framers have clearly said that Congress shall make no law, and no law means no law. So let's just say that everyone in this country has a right, has an unconditional right to say what he wants, and there is no restriction. On the other hand, the non-absolutists, and this time this was the justices who were both liberals and conservatives. Actually, this is the first time that the liberals and the conservatives got together, because otherwise they're always fighting with each other. But they ganged up against the absolutists, and they said that, look, yes, we agree that the language of the First Amendment is that Congress shall make no law, but then we can't allow people an unconditional right to say what you want, because that would be just anarchy. Okay. And therefore, we must have some kind of restrictions in society if we are to curb this right, and if we are to make other rights meaningful. So the absolutists were led by Justice Hugo Black and Justice William Douglas, and on the other side, you had Justice Brennan and Justice Rehnquist and Justice Powell and several other justices. So this then obviously was a debate between them, and as far as the free speech, as far as the doctrine is concerned, how has the US Supreme Court enforced that? I think there are two cases. There are several cases, because there is a whole bunch of cases that all of us can do. We can go through, but they're really interesting. But according to me, there are two cases which really stand out. And the first one, sorry, I've mentioned New York Times first actually, but the first one is actually Abrams. It's a 1919 case, Abrams versus United States, a 1919 case. So let me talk about that first. So Abrams in the background, what happened is that three cases came to the Supreme Court before Abrams, and they were all the first one was Schenck, the second one was Frower, and the third one was Debs. And in all these cases, the US Supreme Court articulated the clear and the present danger test. Okay, if you'll all have heard this actually, that you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. That's what the US Supreme Court said, that look, we'll protect every possible speech, but we will not protect that speech that presents an immediate danger, that incites people to commit offenses, that stokes hatred. So this is clear. The Supreme Court said that we'll apply this test and we won't allow that. In all these three cases coming to the court before Abrams, the great Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, he wrote for the majority of the court. But in Abrams, interestingly, there were two leaflets that were involved. One leaflet, okay, just before I forget actually, but also remember that 1919 was just the end of the First World War, and US had taken a part in the First World War, as a result of which several people in the US were criticizing the US for taking part in the First World War or taking sides. So in Abrams, there were two leaflets, and one leaflet made fun of the president of the US, and the leaflet mentioned that the president is so ignorant because he's chosen to interfere in the First World War and take sides. And the second leaflet mentioned, it actually it told something to the workers, that workers unite, and our common enemy is capitalism, and you've got to, let's march to our revolution, something of that kind. And so when this came before the court, Justice Clark wrote for the majority of the court, and he thought it's easy, that he thought that this speech, these leaflets present a clear danger, an immediate danger. And he said that, look, I'm not going to protect this speech. And he held the petitioners liable under the libel statute. It was a Sedition Act. It was a Sedition Act. Surprisingly, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, he wrote his dissent, which is one of the most celebrated dissents, and which is one of the most powerful speeches, I would say, on free speech. And I mean, I can't do better than it's to be, this paragraph is to be quoted. And this is what he said, that, but when men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe even more than they believe the very foundations of their own conduct, that the ultimate good desired is better reached by a free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. That, at any rate, is the theory of our constitution. It is an experiment, as all life is an experiment. Every year, if not every day, we have to wager our salvation upon several prophecies based on imperfect knowledge. I think, and these words are most important, I think that we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression of opinions that we loathe, that we hate, and believe to be fraught with death, unless they so imminently threaten immediate interference with the lawful and pressing purposes of the law, that an immediate check is required to save the country. So this is again that clear and present danger test. But here, interestingly, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes found that those two leaflets were nothing more than silly, and they didn't really incite people, and there was no immediate danger in that case. The case that comes after it, actually, it's long, New York Times versus Sullivan. It's a 1964 case. And obviously, New York Times versus Sullivan is followed by the Supreme Court thereafter in several other cases. But one thing to note is that New York Times versus Sullivan, when Justice William Brennan wrote for the majority of the court, he did cite Justice Holmes's dissent in Abrams. Now, New York Times versus Sullivan had also very interesting facts. On March 29, 1960, the exact date, civil rights leaders in the US, they published a full-page ad in the New York Times alleging that an unprecedented wave of terror is unleashed against those persons who are pressing for desegregation, especially the black students, Dr. Martin Luther King and his white allies. Just a brief minute on this, just a brief moment on segregation and desegregation. So 1960s were turbulent times in the US because the US always practiced segregation, which means that separating the whites from the blacks. So even all institutions like schools, they had separate classrooms for blacks and whites. And when Dr. Martin Luther King and other black activists, they saw that this is racial discrimination. They came up with this project of desegregation, which means assimilating the blacks and the whites in schools and institutions. So obviously, when they were practicing desegregation, which is assimilating, they were being met with a lot of flack from several governments in the US and several cities in the US because those cities were not willing to accept desegregation. So this ad ultimately made an appeal for funds because they needed funds to practice this. And incidentally, the ad also referred to certain events which had taken place in a city called Montgomery in Alabama. One city commissioner called Sullivan, when he read the ad, he alleged that the ad is defamatory of him because though it did mention his name, it did not mention his name. It said something about his conduct. And he said that, look, Alabama has a libel statute and I'm going to enforce that. So he went to the court. Sullivan was able to convince the jury that the statements made, the incorrect statements made in that ad were defamatory, libelous per se, and the jury therefore awarded him $500,000 in damages against all these defendants. The Alabama Supreme Court affirmed the case, went to the US Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court reversed. The court unanimously said that, look, we are not going to enforce this libel statute. And the court was clear. The court said that, look, when it comes to public persons, public officials, public matters of public concern, public acts, the Supreme Court said that even if the statements are defamatory and false, we will not allow damages unless the petitioners are able to show that the statements were actuated by malice. which is almost impossible. Malice means obviously C-enter, which means that you have to have that the mens rea requirement. So, but here again, Justice William Brennan, who was not an absolutist, he said these words are very important, and this is what he said, that thus we consider this case against the background of a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues, notice, debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open, and that it may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government and public officials. The present advertisement, as an expression of grievance and protest on one of the major issues, public issues of our time, segregation, desegregation, would seem clearly to qualify for constitutional protection. The question is whether it forfeits that protection by the falsity of some of its factual statements and by its alleged defamation of respondents. So this was the question. And again, what did he say on this? He said, erroneous statement, notice, erroneous statement is inevitable in free debate and must be protected if freedoms of expression are to have the breathing space that they need to survive. I'm sure Arnab Goswami is reading this because this, he'll need this. And Justice Hugo Black, as I said, who was an absolutist, he gave a concurring, he obviously sided with the majority, but he also gave a concurring opinion. And his last line was this, because he was not willing to put any kind of restriction. He said that an unconditional right to say what one pleases about public affairs is what I consider to be the minimum guarantee of the First Amendment. I regret, look at this, I regret, he says this for the majority of the court, I regret that the court has stopped short of this, holding indispensable to preserve our free press from destruction. So clearly Justice Black said that, look, I am not willing to put any kind of restriction on the free speech. And well, I mean, he concurred with the majority because they did not hold the petitioners liable under the libel statute. But he said that, look, this is an unconditional right, and I'm not willing to put any restriction on that. So that's how New York Times pretty much sums up the Abrams and New York Times. They pretty much sum up the free speech jurisprudence in the US. So this after having said all this, we come to, let's conclude. Let's sum up that what do we take away from this webinar? Well, one, clearly we have seen that there are two valuable rights in issue. One is the right to free speech under Article 19(1)(a), subject to reasonable restrictions, and the other is my and our right not to be defamed, right to reputation under Article 21. Two, does one trump the other? No, the Supreme Court is clear. The Supreme Court says that it is a duty of the courts to try and strive to strike a balance between the two and protect both as far as possible. Three, how does the Supreme Court achieve that balancing exercise? As I told you, it's all about drawing lines and applying several tests. And obviously one of the tests that Justice Mishra gave us is the contemporary community standards test. And obviously you also have the prior restraint test actually, but as I said, it all depends on the facts of the case before you. Fourth, modern times, today's times, where there is a splurge of social networking sites, this age of cell phones and information technology, according to me clearly, since we have become the drivers of our own vehicles, I think we need to exercise our free speech right with great circumspection, because obviously the temptation is just to badmouth and to just scandalize and to say bad things about people. So I mean, that's the way human beings are wired, and therefore, I think with this right comes a solemn and a greater obligation to be sober. And lastly, whether we can really usefully rely on U.S. Supreme Court for the free speech cases. Well, I mean, I'm not being arrogant, but my firm view is that apart from the fact that there is a distinction between 19(1)(a) and their First Amendment, I think that we can obviously use them wherever we can, but I don't really advocate, and I don't really feel that we need these cases to evolve as a nation and to have our own jurisprudence of free speech. I don't think we need US cases for that. We have our own constitution, a detailed constitution. We have our own set of cases, and we have excellent judges in the High Court, and ultimately judges, those very judges who go to the Supreme Court, and who will have to draw the line. And I'm sure that this justice would be done on a case-to-case basis, actually, when it comes to deciding between these two rights. So that's that part. I think I'm done. I don't know how I've done on the time, but I'm done.
Shalin, you had indicated 54 minutes. However, you've taken 54.
Oh.
That's the accuracy. We can take queries. We have quite a few queries. I will put the queries to you, and maybe you can answer them wherever you feel. These are very interesting queries because they hinge on a very fine line. You can certainly choose not to answer them or avoid answering them.
I probably won't avoid. I won't answer Anshin's question. Okay, just kidding. Just kidding. Okay.
The first question is, what is the test or a yardstick that can be adopted so that free speech cannot be is not regarded as defamatory? What is the yardstick?
So again, as I told you, we come down to the definition of defamation under Section 499, and if you see, it's a detailed definition which clearly gives out that what material, what publication is defamatory. Okay, but as I told you, essentially, this is an area where maths and science won't work, right? I mean, it's not that you have a magical formula that decides that, okay, I'll apply this formula and the machine will do the work for me, and it will say that, oh, am I on the right side of the line or the wrong side of the line? As I said, it all depends on what was said, and to a large extent, let me say this, that even if you have these objective tests, to a large extent, it will obviously depend on the value judgments of the judges who decide those cases. Because I'll just give, just to give you I give you an example, isn't it? That, well, I mean, you can tell me that, look, Shalin, you are a dud, you are a potted plant. And you can even say that, well, I mean, I'm right in saying, because, I have these instances with me. But on the other hand, well, I mean, I can say that, well, Parth, you're right, but look, there is a reputation to protect here, isn't it? Because, I mean, you can say something not so brutally, okay, isn't it? So, I mean, again, my answer to the question is that I don't think we have this magical formula. It will all depend on what comes up before the court, and the court will have to ultimately draw a line. But let me tell you this actually, that in most of the cases, as reasonable human beings, when we read that material, I think most of us should be able to get it, that whether this is falling on the right side of the line or the wrong side of the line. So that's how I would answer that.
Shalini, the second query is, in a lot of instances, say for example, cases under 498 of the in family laws, false cases are filed, and subsequently there is acquittal. When the family is acquitted, or when the concerned accused is acquitted on the basis, say for example, of a false case, can any action for defamation be initiated against the complainant? Yes,
definitely. So if clearly there is a false case, there is a case which goes to the court, and ultimately there is a ruling in one party's favor, and the court says that this was absolutely, this was a false and a vexatious case filed. I'm sure with that ruling, that person can, under our constitution and under our laws, file a suit. It all depends actually whether it's a state or not actually, because obviously if it's a state, then you have these fundamental rights kicking in. If it's not the state, if it's a private party, then again, you'll have to go to the civil, you can't go to the court, right? I mean, you have to file a suit for that. You'll have to file a complaint. But I'm sure that those successful litigants should be able to get damages against the other party. Oh yes, definitely.
Another query is sedition versus freedom of speech. Is this often misused?
Okay, so sedition is exactly as I mentioned, Abrams versus United States. It was those two leaflets. Parth, again, sedition cases. See, if you see Abrams also was a case decided in that war era, because 1914 to 1918 was the First World War. And as soon as it ended, these were all cases actually of 1917 and 1918, because I'll tell you why. In 1917, in the US, Congress enacted the Espionage Act, okay? And in fact, under the Espionage Act, the Congress said that if a person is to make false statements which interferes with the military success of the US, then that's a crime. Then in 1918, just before the war ended, US enacted a Sedition Act to make it even more stringent. And the Sedition Act actually made it a crime to just mock the US government. Okay, now coming back to the question that sedition versus free speech. Well, first of all, these are not war times as far as we are concerned. If you ask me frankly, I mean, you'll find a lot of seditious writings in the sense that, I mean, for example, just, I mean, let me give you this best example. It's that Arundhati Roy's a piece. Okay, she's written a book called My Seditious Heart. And I think one of her articles, the Greater Common Good about this Narmada Bachao Andolan and the Sardar Sarovar Dam. Well, she ultimately, I believe she was accused of sedition, isn't it? And I personally, if you ask me, I think that unless that speech really incites people to overthrow the government, okay, which is, I think it's a tall order. I don't think I really call that seditious at all. Actually, I would protect that speech. And therefore, whenever, I mean, if you ask me frankly, this is my personal view, that when you come across brilliant authors, like my favorite is, yeah, definitely one of my favorites is Arundhati Roy. And when you come across these authors and when they write, I don't think there is there is a real ground to punish these people, okay, on the ground that this is seditious actually. Because I think, as I told you, I mean, this is the last thing I said, that look, we don't want to go backwards, isn't it? We want to evolve. We want to be forward, and we want to be able to say shocking things, so that only because the public is aware. But yes, I clearly say that if you are inciting people to commit crimes, if you are stoking hatred between communities, I won't allow that. That's clearly, I would say that that's falling on the wrong side of the line. And obviously, overthrowing government is if that kind of speech is there, it's sedition.
Would trolling on Twitter amount to defamation?
Parth, depends. Again, as I said, if you ask me frankly, our Supreme Court is not that forgiving when it comes to naming personas. That's my view. Because, I mean, for example, if you say things in general, for example, if you say things like, as I said, about those temple-going women, if you name them generally, I don't think you're falling on the wrong side of the line. But if you name people, I'm sure the Supreme Court is going to find that, I mean, our case law shows that is something that is not going to be protected, simply because you have that right, the other right not to be defamed, okay, which is begging for attention. So again, trolling, Parth, it all depends, because if it's naming someone, yes, maybe, but if it's just general, I wouldn't really bother about it.
Trial by media versus defamation in the name of freedom of speech.
So this is, yeah, I mean, you find this happening all the time. You have, because there is a lot of irresponsible reporting along with responsible reporting, you have these questions coming up, because obviously there is a case that goes to the court, and that case is also there in the media. and obviously, people are going to think that everyone reads newspapers, and ultimately it's not a question of being influenced, because I'm sure that our judges are I mean, when they judge, they're not going to rely on those newspaper reports. But the fact is that all of us at the end of the day are human beings. Okay. And if you're a human being, you are going to be influenced. And therefore, I mean, I'm not saying that there should be no reporting at all, but because, as I said, these are today's times of social networking and information technology and cell phones, I think there is a greater call for responsible reporting and responsible journalism. And I'll just tell you, I mean, I believe this, and I believe this all my life, that if you ask me frankly, a journalist's stock in trade is truth. It is truth. Because understand one thing, that he's doing a very important job. Because he wants people to know what is going on the other side of the world, because we can't go there, right? So if he's actually a purveyor of communication, then I think, I mean, hyperbole is fine, exaggeration is fine, but I won't really allow irresponsible journalism at all.
A follow-up to that question is, in cases, say for example, like the Me Too cases, there have been allegations which have floated all over. In certain cases, FIRs have been lodged, trials have been initiated. Assuming at the end of the trial, the accused or the person who's accused is acquitted, what would happen in such a situation? Would then, what is the remedy to such a person against not the complainant, but against the people who've covered the case as alleging him or her to be the accused?
No, so Parth, as far as publishers are concerned, the people who publish news items or even these court cases, you can't really hold them responsible, isn't it? Because it's, at the end of the day, only one side is going to win. I mean, yeah, I mean, there are cases where it's 50-50, but several cases actually, only one side is going to win. So if those cases are being reported, you can't really say that, look, the winning side, who was shown as a villain while reporting was done, is now going to sue the publisher and say that, look, I'm going to sue you because you couldn't have mentioned that. So again, it's as I said, I would not be really bothered so long as reporters mention clearly that this is this side of the story, X's side of the story, this is Y side of the story, and then ultimately when it comes up, when the decision is rendered, then either side can obviously sue the other on the ground that this was a totally frivolous and vexatious case, and therefore this was defamation. But as far as the publisher is concerned, who was just merely reporting what was being said in the court and what was being argued, I don't think I would hold him liable at all.
Thank you, Shalin bhai. We've had a fantastic session today with some amazing questions and answers.
The pleasure was entirely mine.
Thank you so much. This brings us to an end of our series after 9 days of some wonderful sessions with all of us speakers. I would like to express a deep sense of gratitude for all the speakers who agreed to come and do these webinars for us. I'm really thankful to all of them. Thankful to the associations, Dhruven Bhai Shah, Vishwesh Bhai, AGFTC, ITBA, all of them, who've also just a phone call and they've agreed to be a part of this exercise. Thank you so much. Fingers crossed, we'll try and bring more and more such informative sessions as far as possible to the best of our abilities. Thank you so much. See you all. Stay safe.
Parth, you are the best. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Shalini.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Parth bhai.
Thank you.
Thank you, Parthi. Can I say one thing?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Friends, today is the 9th day and the last day of the webinar series. The word webinar is new to us. I congratulate President Vishwesh Shah, Dhruven, and you for arranging such a wonderful web seminar for 9 days. It was really very successful. The team behind this also deserve very high praise and compliments from all and one. This is my compliments and congratulations from all the participants as a President Emeritus of Income Tax Bar Association, All India Notary Association of Gujarat and India, or many notary friends from across the India. They are taking part. They have sent the comments also. They wish that this series number 2 may be continued so that they can learn a lot. Still we have time up to 17th. So at least 2-3 web seminar may be arranged. We have heard excellent speeches and talk from learned speakers, right from Sri Thakur, Sri Desai, Justice Devani, Sri Salin Bhai Mehta and others. We are grateful and thankful to them. We have learned a lot. We cannot get all this knowledge even reading hundreds of books that we have acquired in these 9 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinesh bhai, for the kind words. Thank you, Shalin bhai. Thank you, Anshin bhai. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anshin. Thank you.
Stay safe.
Sir, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Dhirej.